sekarang Pak Badi dan saya sudah mereka suatu training dalam masa yang sangat singkat untuk mengeksplorasi sedikit lebih mendalam tentang isu situasikan karya Anda sekalian. Sebab ini merupakan sesuatu isu untuk bukan cuma Anda semua, tetapi untuk saya dan untuk Pak Menteri, isu bagaimana membuat connection di antara karya kita dengan karya yang sudah ada. So masalahnya yang pertama untuk mencari apa yang ada dan membuat, you have to decide also mana yang penting, mana yang tidak penting, mana yang relevan. So the first thing is we're going to do a little bit about how to search. I mean, for some of you, you may have done this, but you know, there is worth thinking about again. How do you find the existing material, the existing literature? Is the first part, and then the second part is how do you connect your work to the existing literature? So it's not enough just to say, okay, so I'm doing this topic, and lots of people, this person has written this about it, and that person has written that about it, and then the person's here. That isn't enough. Yeah, you have to say, and I think what I'm doing is a little bit of person A, a little bit person B, and I reject person C entirely, or something, right? So we're going to talk a bit about that, and we have devised an imaginary research project. So we will try to go through it with this imaginary topic. So what is it? It's going to be something about heritage and Jogja and gentrification and, I don't know, applying for UNESCO World Heritage status and what the effect is of that. And so our imaginary research that we did was to interview people living in the old part about, I don't know, the proposed changes and how this has had an impact on them. What else do we do?
Actually, it's a really good topic, actually. It's a really good article, actually. So, what then, how, if you were to send a draft article about this idea, and you received feedback and said, you need to situate your work, or you need to locate your ideas within the existing literature in order to demonstrate that your idea is original, then how would you do it, right? I mean, it's not just as, like I was saying, you just list what previous people have said. You have to connect it to actually what they say. But that requires a particular way of reading and a particular way of thinking in order to take that information out and put it into your article. And I'm not sure that everyone knows how to do that. I know this even from my other colleagues who submit from everywhere to the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. That approach, or that requirement, is not understood. Nor are people actually explaining how should it be done. You know, so when we say, think about the previous approaches or previous theories, how do we know where the theory is in the earlier article? How do we know what an approach is? How do we know what the methods might be? So for instance, on several of the papers that I looked over, I said, you need to talk about your method, you know, the conditions where you, and the places where you received your data. You have to describe that. What are your questions? What were the circumstances? Who was in your focus group? How did you choose your focus group? What questions did you ask? What did you expect from your answers? And what did you get that was not expected? All these things need to be laid out. And what your method sometimes is a way of showing that your paper is new and original, because previous scholars who looked at Jogja and heritage didn't use the same method. Maybe they looked at different focus groups, or maybe they looked at different archives of texts. So that's another way of establishing the importance of your paper, is by knowing how to look at your work in relation to previous. And how to do that is, I think, a major part of this entire process. So first, locating And so how do you know if the sources are located or are important? Or that's a big challenge. And some of the tricks we've suggested is if you look at some of the more recent articles, they would probably summarize already for you what are the different approaches or what have been the main ideas and debates that have been connected to that topic. So the key is the search, actually. And so that's what we're going to walk through. So the topic, the imaginary topic is Jogja heritage.
What shall I put in this? What shall I put into Jason?
So it deals. So if you think about the topic, it's about heritage. It's about memory. It's about what else is it about? Heritage, memory, history. Conservation, history, preservation, things like that. But then which theory should you, or which search items are most important depend on which angle that you want to push forward, which argument or set of arguments do you want to generate or to talk about. And that depends on which journal you want to send it to. So if you're sending it to Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, you probably need to look at it from a regional perspective first, at least. And that will be determining your search words or terms. If you want to send it to an international journal of urban studies, or of heritage, or of management, or public history, or some of these related fields, then again your search engine will change, or your search terms will change. So maybe we should suggest.
You should ask what field do you want?
If you were writing this, where would you want to send it? What type of journal do you think you would want, or your administrators would want you to send your articles to, if you were to focus on Jogja heritage, memory, preservation, commemoration? What sort of journals do you think you would like your work to appear in? Or how about this? What are some possibilities? What are some possible journals? Just at the top of your head. Not the names of the journals. You could say like a journal that focuses on such and such, a journal that focuses on such and such. So what are some journals you guys think for this type of topic? So Abe, here, tourism. So tourism, so a journal of tourism. So that might be one sort of journal that we might focus on. What's another one? Heritage, right? Heritage. History also, Abe, but I mean it's going to be a big one. So right, so heritage, history. I sort of already gave you an answer. Urban studies, actually, this is about a city, and that has to do with it. Tourism. Those are three good ones. Those are three good possibilities. So what you would need to do then is you would need to think about, okay, how have scholars of tourism approached this topic? How have scholars of heritage approached this topic? And how have scholars of, what's the third one? Urban studies approached this topic. So we can...
The only thing I know about this, so I think about the first one, so I spelled it wrong. The only person I know who works on this. So this is probably not the way you were going to tell them to do it.
Probably not, but it's okay.
Yeah, well, no, let's do it the way you're going to do it.
Okay, so you can start off with JSTOR. JSTOR is an archive of interdisciplinary, or different disciplines, different themes, journals that have been collected from all the way back, some all the way back into the early 19th century, actually, or late 19th century. The topics that you have can go by discipline and by theme. So maybe we could go to the part where it says we can do a search where it's advanced search. Okay, so you've already done the search actually.
No, I haven't. So let's go back to page.
So there are three fields here: urban studies, tourism, and heritage. Most likely, what you can do is, okay, so if you go to click to below the search engine part, there we go.
Yeah.
So if you go down to here with advanced search, you can manage your filters better. So first of all, you can say, well, what are we looking for? We can look for Jogja, or Jogja. Properly, right? And then maybe heritage, right? And then you can add a field. You can put tourism. Okay, we can scroll down actually. So we can scroll down. Okay, all we want right now is articles because you have no time to read books at the moment. You've got 24 hours to do this, right? So we'll do that. Okay. So then we can. This is the best part here. You can see all the range of articles and themes and areas. So we might take Asian studies because that covers the Jogja side. Was it Indonesia, right? We can. We can do architectural history. You know, we can scroll down to, oops, sorry. We can scroll down, perhaps development studies, I'm not sure, but I mean, we can do the basic ones, we'll do the major ones. So, the heritage is not even here, but we maybe just do history. We can do urban studies. Tourism is not in there. My sense is that it might be under sociology. I mean, so that's, you have to understand what the disciplines are, and so maybe you have to think about, well, where is tourism, how's tourism studied? It's usually studied within sometimes sociology, sometimes it's studied within anthropology, and sometimes it's studied within geography. So we can put that down there. And so this is terrific. So you can see here, 88 titles. Those are 88 journals. And you're accessing all of the contents within each of those journals from 1960 to now, or actually usually it's about a 5 to 10 year embargo. So I mean, it might be up to say 2005 or something like that. But still,
it will give you the title, right, of the embargo phase, or not?
Yes, it might.
So you might not get the full text, but you
press search, and you see what comes up. So out of all of those, we got 83s. 83. Civil Society in Indonesia, Sojourn. So this is a Southeast Asian Studies journal. We may or may not want to send it there. We want to send the journal Southeast Asian Studies instead. I'm just kidding. Competition, patriotism, collaboration, probably not. This is probably not connected.
Kawi Classics, probably.
Probably not there. Cruelty and Innocence and Leiden, Illusion of Illusion, Soothing Song for Exile, no, probably not. Historical Studies, that's an overview, that's an older article. So it looks like what's happening is that the search is producing stuff that is probably not what we want to focus on.
No.
So what I would probably do then is just go back and make it simpler. And just go back just to urban studies, for instance. Let's see where we are. So go back. Heritage. Yeah, okay. Another thing we could do is maybe it's too specific. Maybe we just do Indonesia first. Look at heritage. Maybe then you can place it within the context of Indonesia first, then Jogja. If you're not finding things on Jogja, what does that also mean? You're doing original important work. Actually, that might be also a possibility. So here we go. The role of land rights in urban heritage management. So that's probably a good one, right? So we can.
That might be our article.
That actually might be the article that we just described.
We just imagine.
Conservation education, okay, that's in Bangkok. Reviving the Betawi tradition, okay. State constructs of ethnicity and the reinvention of Malaysian, that sounds interesting because it's also done in Singapore. You know, so but that's not really what we're doing. But these are related articles, and it talks about the modern architecture of Indonesia, maybe, you know. So what you try to do is find the, here,
Perceived social effects.
okay, here we go. So this is not dealing with Jogja,
Yeah.
but it's dealing with.
So let's say our data that we collected is interviewing people who live in the center or who work in the center, and what do they think about, I don't know, proposed changes to the way, so like heritageization, which is basically, what is this called? Social perceptions of perceived social effects
of tourism.
So this is the same kind of method, presumably. What you're investigating is what people think about it. So even though it's about Kirvalu, that's fine.
So we can download the article, and then we can, so for instance, because one of the papers is about Mount Merapi and the social capital considering the communities, this doesn't have to do with the same thing, but it's a very close topic here. I mean, it's just dealing in a different space, actually. So I accept, see the PDF, you draw it down, and then we have to then look at this source to draw from it the important theoretical ideas. I mean, how are they thinking about this topic? Then look at their method, look at their sources, and maybe look at their conclusions. Those are 4 or 5 things.
Look at their bibliography.
And look at their bibliography. So, okay. So here we have an article.
Ideally, they already did this, right? They already did what you're doing now. So there is nothing wrong with having a look at. I mean, there's no guarantee they did it well, right? You hope that they did it reasonably well, but it gives you somewhere to start. So let's say you're really starting, which you wouldn't be. You wouldn't be starting from nowhere, but you can look at what methods they used and what were the major authors that the style, and then you also have to pick over it a little bit because they've already done it. I mean, then you do it with, you find a couple of these and do the same thing and see if this article missed out something really important, and you'll get it from, so even though it's not about Jogja, that's, really not the main point.
So you can even see in their abstract, for instance, they're describing their method right off the bat.
Yeah.
They're saying local residents, 378, were surveyed using a questionnaire, and the collected data were subjected to a series of descriptive analysis methods. Then it goes on to talk about the questions that they had, the respondents, what they said. So this is actually not a very good abstract. But what this part should be in the text. This abstract should tell you what is the article about, how, very generally, what are its conclusions, and why it's important, right? But anyway, so they go in, and so they start to talk about setting it in context. What is tourism? It's in global context, so I'm skimming. They talk about what is the idea of tourism. That's also a very important approach when you're doing your work. What are the terms you are using? What are the categories? So I'm just going to draw from some of from your papers that I read already. So when we talk about social capital, what do we mean by social capital? It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different scholars. So defining that's important. When we talk about symbolism, again, for another mountain, right? What do we mean by symbolism? And so you can define it. You say, yes, we know that people define it differently. This is how we're defining it for this term. Opium is talked about by scholars in a certain way. Sometimes it's a product. Sometimes it's seen as a descriptor to talk about a war. And sometimes it's actually an industry. Sometimes it can be seen as a medicinal context. So there's a lot of ways to define the categories that you are using. Here they've talked about, just skimming, looks like they talked about the place. And so so just from here you can sort of skim and say, okay, this person or these scholars are describing the tourism spot. They are talking about the context of it. World, region, Malaysia. They talk about, so and they talk a little bit about how other scholars have also focused on this topic. So this is a nice way of saying, okay, we'll bring those into our bibliography, and they actually already summarize it for you. So what you can do is you can actually go to those works on your own. It helps you save time, but you should take a look at them and read them as well. So let's see where there's their approaches. Sure.
In the case of, for example, my work, I spend a lot of works on it, right? So if we come across with a large number of publications, books, articles, how we can distinguish which is the most important, work that can be really used as a standard, for example, in making a map of discourse for this topic?
Yes, that's a great question. And it has to do with your method, actually. Ideally, you should be collecting and doing your bibliography before you start writing your work, right? So what that means is you shouldn't be waiting to get feedback from an editor to say you need to situate your work, and then you have to go find sources for it. Those sources, those secondary sources, should have been done even before you started writing. Because in order to progress to a research topic in the very beginning, you should find out what has been written about the field so far so that you know what is original, like I spoke about on Friday morning. How do you know that your topic is original, it's fresh, it's new? You would have to go through most of the work that has already been written, right? And then you should be able to see, well, whose name keeps on popping up when it comes to citations in terms of the authors that are most intimately connected to this topic. And so you might see, for instance, Eric Tekakoza name come up. You might see Howard Dean's name come up. You might see some of the other major scholars of opium come up. And then you can maybe choose the 5, right? And then look at their works. And look at how did they each look at this question of opium. And then talk about what were the questions that they used. What was the evidence that they used? What were the good things about the evidence? What was the bad things about the evidence? Where were the gaps? What were their findings? And how does that relate to what you are doing? So you may say, well, I didn't like 3 of those authors' approaches because they were focusing on British sources, or they were focusing on Dutch sources. You have discovered a whole collection of memoirs that are talking about the anti-opium campaign. And so your story is about an Indonesian narrative within the context of opium, right? And so this is my difference. They're focusing on sort of the Dutch and international perspective, which you're not rejecting, but you are emphasizing a different chapter of a broader story, using different evidence, asking different questions. But the only way you can know that is by doing the bibliography search from the beginning. And so this is why at the very beginning of my presentation I said we are dealing with the publication side, which is only at the end of the process. But you can see what happens if you don't do a proper bibliography search and then read it and do a proper literary review before, so you can see where the field is and where the gaps are. Only then can you find a research topic that fits into a gap, or a debate within what's out there. So your question is very good because, look, you could get a whole range of data. So you just have to skim, take the last 10 years or the last 5 years and say, well, whose names keep on popping up? And then read those works very carefully, and then your lit review can be based on them. It doesn't have to be connected to the journal that you want to publish in. In fact, you shouldn't even be thinking about the journal that you want to publish in at this point. You should just be thinking about what are the main ideas and how do my ideas connect, or how do my interests connect. But so your interest shouldn't actually even come up until you've done the bibliography review or the literature review. So process and the sequence of the research process is very important. So it's kind of funny at this point because the feedback now has been, okay, situate your work. So that means you're kind of having to go back a few steps to get back to the bibliography and do reading, which is why it's going to be hard for you to finish your article today or tonight, whenever it's due, because many have to actually go back to the sources, the secondary sources, in order to find the literature. But there's fast ways to do it, so this is what we're trying to tell you how to do it. So maybe check who are the top, I don't know. We can find, for instance, we can find the names of folks here. So this is probably not a really good article. So what you might find out is that this is very descriptive. This is not actually maybe talking about approaches, the ideas that are associated about it. So you say, you know what? This is not talking about the field. This is not talking about tourism as a field, broader approaches. So that means...
Well, actually, the thing about this article, just skimming it, is just one of my pet peeves, which is it takes up the first 2/3 of the article without talking about
what's about
its own research. You know, spending a lot of time in X, let's talk about this, blah, 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 summary of other people's work. So, and, you know, this is, it's like the authors need to know that, and we all, you know, whatever you're doing, you need to know that, but it doesn't need to be in the article. You know, people are going to read your article not for, you know, this part where you are kind of connecting it and all of that. It's, I don't know, how many pages? Would you say?
I would say maybe 2 or...
Yeah, 2, 3? I mean,
just
something like
summaries,
that,
yeah.
a bit. Not 10 out of a 20-page article. That means you spent half of your space on other people's stuff, right? The whole point of it is that you want to, that this is my work, which fits into a bigger context. I'll show you how it fits in, or how it challenges it, whatever. But most of the article should be about your work, how you found that, you know, how you designed it, what were the limitations of your survey, the kind of nuts and bolts of your work, and then what you think about it. Not, I think sometimes people do it to say, look, I know all these things, I've got it, you know, I've done my due diligence, which is great, and you have to do it, but it should not really be taking up that much space in your article. So if the person has to read half or sometimes 2/3 of the way through it before they get to what you are doing, then they're quickly going to lose patience.
And also, it depends on your field. So, like, that's why I actually suggested for your papers, maybe just a paragraph, and each sentence could actually cover a whole generation of an approach. You know. So, for instance, colonial scholars approached heritage by asking these sorts of questions.
Brackets, this person,
Right.
full stop.
Or footnote. The second session, nationalist domestic scholars approached heritage as a way of talking about national history and national identity. Second sentence, third sentence, and then, you know, footnote or parentheses, scholars. Now, next generation of scholars, shaped by area studies, say Southeast Asian history, decided that it wasn't really about heritage that they wanted to look at. They were looking at the cultural symbols and ideas that were being displayed. And so taking it back and comparing it to maybe a long continuity of Southeast Asian experience. So a heritage, a focus on a temple, refurbishing a famous temple, actually was seen in its broader regional context as a continuity of connections between communities and sacred spaces. So, post-colonial scholars, which is your fourth sentence, are approaching the whole production of knowledge, you know. And so, in other words, you could basically cover a whole 4 or 5 generations of scholars in 5 sentences or so, 4 or 5 sentences. But how do you get to that synthesis? How do you get to those 5 sentences? How do you know what to say? That means you actually have to do the reading of some of these scholars and then try to group them into trends, or group them into genres, you know, or group them into styles, you know. So certain scholars were interested in this particular theme or agenda. Other scholars were interested in these sorts of questions. So you can arrange them in any way you want. So that one paragraph basically says, this is what the field has been doing. The next paragraph, but this is what I'm doing. I like these questions that so-and-so are asking, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit to focus on different sources or a different place, you know, because the story of Jogja is different from the story of Jakarta, you know, this sort of thing. Or the story, you know, of the highlands in Vietnam are very different from the lowlands, you know. So what heritage might mean is different. So what's crucial is not just finding the articles, but also reading them and synthesizing them and grouping them into a particular pattern. So like when I brought in the example about you're entering a room and there are different conversations, not only and you have to find out what those conversations are, that's what you're doing here. You're finding the different authors, like, well, what are they talking about? So folks writing between 1985 and 1995, just random dates, are focused on these sorts of conversations. But you can organize it in any way you want. So, I mean, these are the sorts of things you might have to do. So I've switched the search to focus on heritage approaches. Heritage approaches. So that maybe we will find people who focus on approaching heritage or thinking about heritage. And so I will probably go back to Asian studies, and then we'll go to urban studies. Or maybe not even urban studies.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, sure, go ahead.
In case of we have, already having literature, how important is that, for example, should we also think about the more updated, about the latest version of the latest work of this? For example, we do have, several scholars, for example, have been produced in Asian studies. James Scott is a big name, but we also know that there are a lot of news study about the same topic. But we know that the previous study is kind of a benchmark or standard goals, while news one is also popping year after year. But even when we were writing the review, the new study come up, and then should we just include it also as a? I mean,
yes.
How important was like the updated versions of?
Yeah.
I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
The way I see the conceptualization of my work, using the concept of brokerage, and it's like a very old concept, and my problem is how to refresh it. And then I look into the discussion of that in the context of land grab and Journal of Western Studies, and the discussions is situated in the debate about because I focus this kind of brokerage in the state institutions. So, but focusing not on the institution itself, but on the actor. And the discussion of this in the Journal of Western Studies has been moving into state-mediated land acquisition or state-facilitated land acquisitions. And also, the other conversation about this is the elite's perspective of land acquisition. So, there are many newest, I think, concept about that. And I don't know whether I have to stick with my concept of brokerage because there are many, comments
you
about
like
that.
the concept, right?
I like the concept.
Works.
I like the concept
yeah.
because I see it how it works on the ground, and I would like to expand it.
Yeah.
And because I think the lack in it or the gap in it is using the idea of brokerage is only not as constituted in the web of relations. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't, there's this kind of danger of trends, right? So everybody starts talking about this, so do you then have to talk about that too? And so abandon a perspective that you genuinely think is very useful and there is a gap in the literature. So if it were me, I would say stick with it. And you say, okay, so everyone's talking about this, other perspectives, and that's all very interesting. However, there is a gap. We should still attend to, these other issues. This has been, neglected in current scholarship, and there's a place for it, and I'm going to show you why it's important. And in a way, then you're kind of, carving out your own space, rather than just kind of going with the trend. I mean, but it's important that you show, okay, I know what the trend is. They're all doing that. That's fine for them. It has a place, it's interesting work. I'm not looking at different questions, therefore I need this approach, and I think it's valid for these reasons. So you don't ignore it. You definitely show that you're aware of where all this stuff is going, but you have very valid reasons to do what you're doing, so you need to state them and just go for it.
I think that's the key. like I just said, you have to spend at least a paragraph or two talking about why you think brokerage is still important as a concept, as a way of looking at this issue. What that means, though, is that you also have to show, you might have to get into the discussion about why did people move away from brokerage? You know, what were seen as the shortcomings of brokerage that led them to different types of approaches. You might say, actually, though, you think that these aspects were either misrepresented, or maybe they may have only been applicable to those particular case studies. But for your case study, you think that brokerage is still relevant because, like you brought up earlier, it cuts across class issues, it cuts across gender issues, it doesn't privilege any of these sorts of ideas, it may cut across urban-rural divide, brokerage is more neutral. I mean, these sorts of things might be a way to deal with it. So I think what's key is, though, you have to explain, you know, as Malika said, why brokerage you think is still applicable. Because sometimes people, the field, just keep on naming new trends just for the sake of newness, without actually realizing, A, whether, you know, we don't have to do that, what they're actually suggesting may not even be new. They actually might be returning to a different concept that was actually talked about 20 years ago, but it's sort of just been rediscovered. So you have to be careful. So that's where you really need to know the sort of the history of that idea. So when you're talking about brokerage, you should represent it in the context of, say, peasant studies. So scholars have looked at peasant studies and moved away from it, but you still think there's more to say because A, B, C, D, and E. So that is what we are calling situating your theory, at least within the field. There's also situating your sources, in a sense, with the field. Maybe you're focusing on different sources, you know. Again, the trick, though, is that you have to speak about this pretty concisely, very, very tightly, because you don't want to, this is not completely a methodological issue. We want to actually get into what did you find, you know, given this framework and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it would be possible to write like a review article, you know, trends in the field, why have we abandoned brokerage, a kind of theoretical overview, so you can do that. But that's not for the present thing. So if you actually have, you know, material that you want to talk about, so you don't spend a lot of, it's sort of like it's a lot of reading and it's a lot of work and it condenses down into a very short section, which can be a little, you know, you think, oh, but I should get at least 5 pages out of all of this. But actually, you don't want 5 pages, you want 2 or 1.
It just made me think, like, I mean, you could comment on it more, but it makes me think about, at least in old Burmese chronicles and inscriptions, there is a sort of a way of writing chronicles. You have to refer to the genealogy of the king and the dynasty, going all the way back to Ashoka. You have to talk about sort of the Buddhist credentials of a king and so forth. Before you get into what happened, you know, in your dynasty, it's almost like you have to sort of situate your work within a particular universe, right? And so in chronicle writing, at least in the Burmese context, it was in that way. Here in this sort of secular, scholarly world, you're sort of situating it within a particular sort of conversation. I don't know if that's kind of
I mean, there's kind of a template, right, for academic articles, but you don't want to slavishly follow it too much, but you have to be kind of aware, you know, that it does require certain components, and one of them is explicitly or implicitly a literature review. And that kind of intellectual lineage thing is quite important for your readers. You know, they think, okay, where's this going? Who's this? Oh, right, okay. So I was going to mention Ibu Ikmi, actually, her article, which I read, was very interesting, had maybe a similar, a related issue about situating the work, which is, as you mentioned, that there's a controversy about whether Indonesian has modal verbs or not, right? So this is a great opportunity, actually, for you, because if you put that really very early in the article, I mean, page 1, page 2, this is the controversy. These people say there are modal, and then these people say there aren't, and I can show, using this stuff, whether there are or there aren't, or whatever it is, you know. So this is, so you kind of weighing in, or you're contributing to a debate that's going on. So if there is a debate that's going on, it is really good for you, I think.
Yes, I agree. So find what that debate might be, or find out what have scholars been writing about. You can also create the debate, actually, in some ways.
Yeah, you can kind of ferment the
you know,
debate.
in a sense that opium has been looked at in this manner by scholars, and they all have adopted a certain assumption about the role of opium and colonial policy, without realizing that that the anti-colonial or anti-opium campaign was actually very much involving both Dutch and Indonesians. And so you, in a sense, are creating or you're identifying what the gap is in a sense, creating a debate. Or from another example, like with Abi's work, you know, you were talking about the creation of a colonial city. Most approaches to the building of urban spaces and colonialism might have said, well, this is an attempt to for the Dutch to colonize and to create a new way of living for Indonesians. Here you're actually, no, actually this is actually really for the other Dutch. And that's had nothing to do with Indonesia. So again, the controversy or the debate has been that this has always been something that's between two communities, a sort of colonized community and a colonizer community. Here you're saying, no, actually there's complication within the colonizer, right, with your study. So it's in a sense being able to show what the problem is in the scholarship and how you're going to solve it. It's almost like a psychologist saying, you know what, you've got issues. Let me tell them what they are, and here, let me solve them for you. I mean, that's the selling. That's what, in a sense, what psychologists are doing, right? Although, sorry, they don't want psychologists here. But in a sense,
they go, what do you think your issues
are? What are your issues? You know, but let me help you resolve them. Actually, no, these are the self-help people who are selling things. But that's in a sense what you're doing. You're saying these past scholars have been focusing on these particular issues without realizing that this has been the debate. So again, back to brokerage. They're saying they left brokerage too soon because it's in favor of looking at these webs of, what you said, the webs of relationships, which are talking about is at a different scale, you know, which is important. But what that's neglected is the local, the very local, the individual story that's within that web. So brokerage might still be very applicable, or maybe a combined sort of perspective, both the breadth of the web of relations as well as the specificity of the brokerage model. So you're dealing with breadth and the very small, minute area. And I think that's probably your next article, because people say, one side is saying web, other one's saying brokerage, how do you synthesize the two? That's your next article, you know, and so that debate might come up later. So I mean, this is a way of sort of dealing with the existing literature and bringing your originality into the paper. Is it tea time? I'm not sure if I need any more coffee. I've been like, wow.
Maybe.
Any other questions?
It's a slightly random, session. But so, are there any questions about?
Conserving the past, mobilizing the Indonesian future, archaeological sites, regime, and the heritage politics in Indonesia. So this article will, just from the title, is already telling you a lot, which is also a very good lesson. Your title should
be very informative.
Be very informative. It doesn't have to be long, but it has to be attractive. It has to be capture your attention, and also be at the same time pretty specific. Conserving the past, mobilizing the Indonesian future. And so maybe like after the coffee break, we can go into this and show how would we draw from it to situate our imaginary project, which actually I think is a really good topic to actually write about, that we would consider for our journal.
Please send us engaging with the other material, so you need to, and how to do it in in a constructive fashion, I guess. You know, so you may disagree with it, and the value of your research may be that you do disagree with it, and you take issue with it. But how do you do it without making enemies forever or something like that? Or I guess when you're submitting a paper to be considered, if you if you can express it in certain terms, it will be much more attractive for the journal editor, because they think, right, this is a critique, and it's also in the right spirit and conducted in a way that it's going to move the field forward. Rather than if it's a hatchet job on somebody, we will have a great deal of trouble publishing it. Even though we may really welcome the critique, and it could be really something that would be helpful for the field, but if it's sort of highly aggressive, kind of takedown, then I personally would take, you'd really have to think very carefully about it. So we thought we would show you as an example. So this is a review. Well, maybe why don't you talk about it? It's got more your sort of field, but it's kind of. It's a very interesting example because it's sort of very, very skillful, very consummate, and personally I would find it very hard to do this, but you can take something away from it maybe and just, to have it as an idea or a model in your mind, even though you may not be doing. So this is a book review, and it's 15 pages of extremely detailed, a critique of something, which, in an article you're not going to do that, we don't want you to do that, but there's an aspect of it that maybe we can all take something from.
I agree, and when we spoke about earlier about when you read someone else's work, you're trying to find out what do they think, what's their approach, what are their sources, and what are their conclusions about a particular topic. That's the first step, is identifying those items. But the second then is, how then do you write about them? What sort of language do you use? How do you then connect it to your own work? So part of this is the language of the way you use it, but it's also what do you say, or how do you say it when you are reviewing somebody's work. And so Vic Lieberman's review essay, this is an essay as opposed to a book review. Book reviews are usually about 800 words. This one is about 15 pages, so that's about, 7,000 words or something like that, right? He was asked to do a review of a very controversial but exciting piece of scholarship that was coming from a famous political scientist named James Scott, who many of you have probably read something about since he's very old and he's been writing, for the last 25, 30 years. And in this work, what he was proposing through his book called The Art of Not Being Governed was that we have been approaching Southeast Asian history, mainland Southeast Asian history, from a perspective that is usually that of those people who live in the river valleys. And that these are the majority peoples, ethnically majority peoples, who have a particular perspective on life, a particular historical experience, and it's their narratives that have shaped our understanding of the nation states that have emerged from them. So he's basically saying that all the histories that we know tend to be of that particular main group. He was suggesting that there is a different way of thinking about history of the mainland, and that is from, spatially, the perspective of the highlands, the minority groups who tend to live in the hills, but also that this type of perspective is one that also is a different narrative of mainland Southeast Asia. Instead of a history of states and polities that have expanded from kingdoms to form empires and empires to form nations, what we're not hearing is the story of flight, of escape to the hills, to the frontier. Because in American history, which he comes from the American experience, the frontier represents freedom in American consciousness. So the places that don't have the state, a man can do or a woman can do what they want. And I think he is taking this idea from Wisconsin, from where he came from, which had a historian named Turner who talked about the frontier thesis. And so he was taking this idea and applying it to the highlands of Southeast Asia. he suggests that people fled the state. They ran away from Bagan. They ran away from Angkor. They ran away from Daiviet to the hills. They didn't want to be part of the state. And in fact, he says that has continued even to the modern period, which we see ethnic minority groups fighting for their rights and for their freedom. And so it's basically taking a very 20th century experience and projecting it back into the past and saying there's this history. So that's basically his argument. Vic Lieberman, a historian, not a political scientist, felt that he needed to write an extensive review about this book because it was receiving a lot of attention. People were excited. There was this place called Zomia, this
we never heard of before.
which we've never heard before for Southeast Asia. I would always ask, so what's the Southeast Asian term for Zomia? Of course, there is none. So it actually is an example of a Western political scientist from New Haven taking a term, Zomi. Zomi is a word that actually refers to Highland people, and called Zomia, the land of Zomia, which he used a very nice picture of a map of all just the highlands and said, why don't we write a history from this perspective? Now, that was exciting to people because they said, yes, this is a new way of thinking about Southeast Asian history. And Jim Scott suggests that this was a trend that had occurred over the centuries. Victor Lieberman, an early modern historian, felt otherwise. So he figured he needed to intervene by writing a review of the book. And so this is what we're going to talk to you about as an example of what a high professional standard might be in terms of how do you engage a controversial or exciting book. Controversial I shouldn't say controversial, it depends on if you see it as a controversy or not, I suppose. But it was seen as being fresh, new, exciting, but he felt that he needed to engage with it. And so...
But was it deeply irritating to certain people?
Yes, actually
many
for...
people find it deeply
we should say that, especially afterwards, and after Vic's, because Vic is seen as being one of the main historians of early modern Southeast Asia. And so he thought, I need to sort of relook at this. And after this, people start saying, yes, there is very little historical evidence connected to Jim Scott's arguments. But instead of saying it like that, in those stark words, he said it in 15 pages. But what he did was something that I think as a professional ideal, not everybody can do this. He demonstrates a certain level of sophistication, commitment to his colleague, and for the amount of time and work and effort this colleague might have put into this work, and also the giving respect to the excitement that it has generated. And so what he does first, as he goes through his book review, is starts off at the title. He doesn't say, why Jim Scott is wrong, as the title. He says it as a question. A zone of refuge in Southeast Asia, meaning this is reference to slaves and people running away from the state. He says, reconceptualizing interior spaces. So he poses it as a question, as something that you and I, as a reader, can also engage in a conversation. So already, it's very disarming. It's very gentle, in that sense. Yeah. And so he says, poses a problem. So the subtitle is The Art of Not Being Governed. Oh, that's the title, actually. That's the title. So he gets into the review. So what he does very well in the first, I don't know, is it five pages or something? Is he represents accurately Jim Scott's book and the argument. This is something that is absolutely important that you do and are able to demonstrate when you are doing a literature review, whether it's for a proposal, whether it's for an article. You have to take the time to represent the work accurately. If you don't, you're not doing your professional due diligence. You're supposed to make sure you represent the work. Even if it's in simple terms, you need to make sure that it's accurate. Don't put words into an author's mouth that she never wrote, right? So he goes through and talks about what Jim Scott says. Now, he doesn't get into saying that he's wrong right away. He represents the argument, in case you haven't read the book. He talks about the ways in which the evidence was used, the key themes, the key ideas, and their implications. And he does it in very nice terms. So first of all, he starts off by saying, As with everything he writes, James Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed is original, articulate, ambitious, provocative, iconoclastic. So he's saying, he talks about by saying, he tries to find something that's positive, right? But he says that his work has always been important. So already he's being generous with his work. Now, one colleague that you all know, Merle Rickliffs, the famous Indonesia historian, was always saying to me, no matter what, when you're reviewing students' work or colleagues' work, try to find something positive in whatever they say, or whatever they do at the beginning. Start off with something positive. Vic does that too. Vic Lieberman does that too. But he does it for 5 pages, or how many pages? You want to go on into it?
So I get, but one of the things is that, you don't want to have something positive that is so general that it kind of feels like it's not true, right? Because people are going to, whether it's your students or whatever, they know it's faking it, right? So, I mean, these words are so carefully chosen. They really very accurately represent what James Scott's trying to do. Provocative, iconoclastic, I mean, that is exactly, and ambitious, all of these things, that is what it does. So it's in a way you have to spend some time trying to see it from the perspective of what was the author trying to do. You might think, actually, those goals are not valid because as a scholar, your goal should be to be correct rather than to be provocative or something like that, right? But you can read it and you think, okay, well, this person really thinks, their values are this, or they're trying to try to see what they're trying to do and recognize that and say, okay, so it's trying to do this, to understand it on its own terms and in terms of its own values. So even though you may think, actually, I don't agree with these aims, but they are there. And so it's very generously kind of saying, okay, so he's doing all these things, this is how he does it, and reading it very carefully and, again, accurately representing it. So it's no good if you have your literature review and you say, so-and-so said this, and your reviewer reads it, so like, actually, so-and-so did not say this, they said something else, and then the reader starts doubting, and you don't want to, So it takes actually a huge amount of work to produce those couple of sentences, right? Which is sort of a horrible thing, but that's the...
And so what does he do is he shows how James Scott's work is original, articulate, ambitious, provocative, iconoclastic, within the context of Southeast Asian studies, or Southeast Asian history. So he talks about earlier scholars, as you see up there, often viewed the forested highlands of Mid and Southeast Asia. So he demonstrates where Jim Scott's work comes into those conversations. He goes even deeper into it. He talks about the implications of how these peoples who lived in the interior and the uplands and coastal populations, how they interacted and so forth. And he shows how these groups were different or seemed to be different from lowland societies. He goes and shows, for instance, on the top right-hand side, for instance, the ways in which certain anthropologists like Leach and Lehman also are connected to how he connects to their work. So in other words, he summarizes and shows what he's trying to do very accurately. And then he comes off and says specifically, Scott's basic thesis is, boom, right? That highland societies, far from living in isolation, have been profoundly and continuously molded. He goes on to say in the next page, for instance, ultimately, Scott argues, valley-upland interactions were governed by Southeast Asia's chronologically low population densities. So he makes his argument. So what he goes through for the next 5 pages is trying to represent what is being said until it's a lovely statement.
A lot of, he says this and then he says that, and that's very interesting. And,
So this is not something that you need to do for your literature review. What we want you to be able to think about is how will you articulate your reading of a particular author. What we are suggesting is try to make sure that you represent it carefully and accurately, because it's also a statement of your own abilities to the reader. If you are able to articulate and explain what someone else has written accurately and in a way that we understand, this also suggests the quality of your own work and the analysis that's going to follow. So it's...
Well, so he has first, so he sort of sums up everything. Then he says, okay, which is like outside the book, he says, this is Scott's central achievement is to, do this, this, and that.
To bring history, to bring the history of the peoples into the conversation.
And then so, as far as I know, Scott alone has analysed this, this, and that. So he's making judgment that these are the good things, these are actually the groundbreaking things that he's done. And then we have but.
Where's the but? Oh, there's the but.
There's the
but on the right-hand side. But if the art of not being governed has many obvious and outstanding values, or virtues, sorry, it seems to me that it also has serious flaws, right? Killer statement coming up. Its evidential base is often too weak to support its theoretical superstructure. So basically, what he's saying? No evidence. Your theories are...
Your theory has
nothing.
grown old.
But look at the way he said it. He said he built it up by saying all these wonderful things that are accurate and so forth. But then the way he criticizes the language he uses is also important. Its evidential basis is weak, most critically, if you move on down. In analyzing upland behavior, the book leans to monocausal explanations focused on blah, 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 blah. So anyway, so then he goes into and shows where the flaws are.
And it's also worthy of notice that suddenly in the next page we get massive footnotes of, because it's about the evidential base. It's like, right, so the problem is there are factual errors, now we can look at this, and they're all, and here's some statistics.
Statistics to even show.
And statistics in the footnote. I mean, it's quite, yeah. So
it's quite
although
extensive.
it's kind of it's quite devastating, but at the same time, you can't. It's not.
So what does convey actually? It conveys, okay, on one hand, okay, there is controversy brewing over the veracity, over the factual basis for Jim Scott's work, but also how does it reflect Victor Lieberman? It reflects you have a serious scholar who's generous, who is thoughtful, who is diligent. And these are qualities that you want to associate with your own research. So when you're engaging your scholars, who you either want to adopt ideas, because some ideas will be adopted by Jim Scott, by our scholars, who has ideas that people want and who are able to use. Other times you'll be focusing on people or work that is not useful to yourself. So you need to be able to engage this material in a way that also reflects your professionalism. And that's really what it comes down to. One technique that I tend to do, he's saying Scott. I tend to not use the person's name, although sometimes I do, I suppose. I usually say maybe Scott's text, or maybe the argument, the book, the thesis, the evidence. So it's not talking about the person, it's actually talking about the argument or the text. That also takes it away from being personal. It conveys that impression as well. And so for your lit reviews, which will be sections of your articles, or later on books and so forth, this level of diligence is required, which of course means you have to actually read the stuff actually pretty closely.
And think about what you think about it.
Yeah.
And how it relates to your work. So you can read it and you understand it, but then you also have to think, so what does this mean to me, or how do I assess this? I also like that, if you look at this footnote 27, he is really, the claim that Theravada, Burma, and Siam potentially made the ruler into Hindu Buddhist god king is wrong. So it's pretty flat out. It's wrong.
Says wrong.
And then there's the evidence to
look what follows.
Look what follows. I know it's pretty, and it's such detail that you really feel like, okay, he's read it very carefully. He's considered it. He's gone back to the sources, to the other text, and looked at it and thought, oh, this is wrong. So if you are going to say something is wrong,
say that's wrong.
You say it's wrong, but you also are going to have to prove it.
He even actually says, following, although Scott cites my writings to suggest that over 50% of the Amudans were slaves or their descendants, I suggested under 40% actually. So he's actually even saying, Scott didn't do his research properly in citing my own work. Now some people could even say, yes, that's intellectual dishonesty or sloppiness, is actually what the insinuation is. He's been sloppy when it comes to this. But he's been doing it in a gentle way.
It's in a footnote, but it's still there. I mean, it's quite, we were sort of thinking about this, quite passive-aggressive, but...
Now, but also the key structural aspect of this work also is how does he actually go through it. So when you're going through people's work and you're representing it, what he starts off with are what is the context? What's the context of the argument in relationship to existing scholarship? What are the basic ideas? Then he gets into some of the more specific aspects of the themes that he's raising. And then finally, he talks about some of the conclusions and the effects of Scott's analysis to Southeast Asian scholarship by talking about, as like I suggested, what the central achievements are. So when you're reading other people's work, look for those components. Look for the components. Look for what are the main arguments, what's the evidence, what are the implications of those arguments. And you can summarize that in 5 sentences or so, but those have to be very good sentences if you're going to be representing the work carefully. And so sometimes you can do it in a paragraph, other times you might need a page, especially if it's crucial to your own work. The work on the horses in Majapahit. Yeah, where there's a key source. I forget what it is. The key chronicle that you're focusing on. Starts with a B. Yeah.
Something.
Starts with a B. The main chronicle source that your paper talks about, what the horse is and descriptions of it. Must be that one. Yeah. What's important here is, for that work, is to talk about how have scholars used that chronicle and how have they not used that chronicle. And your contribution is showing about all the information that's coming from that particular text. And so being able to show accurately how scholars have used it and not used it would be a very important part of your article too. So these are some of the things in which, where there's not only just the language that you use to speak about someone else's work, but also what aspects do you come out and highlight in your review?
Do you have any questions at this point?
Any questions? I'm trying to think of other examples from the papers, that we read, but this was really more about. There's another example, which would have been something that my dad wrote on Lieberman, which was not as eloquent and sophisticated and polished, diplomatic. My dad uses much more direct languages, direct language, when he was reviewing Scott as well. And I think personally, because of that, people may not also be able to engage Michael Long Quinn's assessment of Scott as readily as Vic's. It's partly because of language. Sometimes people get turned off to, this person is wrong, this sort of thing. And I think with Vic Lieberman's way and diligence and depth of analysis, it allows us to appreciate what is the purpose, is to critique the book, see it for what it's worth, but also to see where its shortcomings are. And I know my dad's review wasn't as thorough, but to be in all fairness, it was because his was an 800-word review as opposed to a 8,000-page word essay, right? Yeah, question.
The Scott's case is based on the evidence, Scott's evidence in the mainland. And then I'm thinking that actually the same case happened in Indonesia, in Java. So in Java there is like a mountain. It's called Labu Mountain, and there are several heritage there. Like temples, there's several. And then And my colleague said that because it's like a kind of like self-vision. People looking for like multi-self-vision, like because they didn't agree or they didn't like the situation in Majapahit, the state, yeah. And then they run to the mountain, yeah, establish. So then, so I think this gives me idea. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing is so attractive about Scott's ideas is that then you think, yeah, you look at the island Southeast and you think, well, all the highland areas are where the not minorities and the Toraja or and the lowland areas are big world delicious, large states, highland areas are, so it's you think, okay, this really works, this is great. And it may be that there are many aspects of the idea that are really worth looking at. And then there may be other aspects that you might think, well, okay, so let's, how can we do it more with greater historical, thoroughness? It's not thoroughness.
Did they cite Scott? Did they cite Scott?
Sorry?
Did the people you were talking about, their work, did they cite James Scott?
No, it's a long time ago.
Oh, so it's before Scott.
He said it's about millenarism. Yeah.
Ah, millenarism, yeah. So that's a whole other range of scholarship too. Jim Scott's also written about that too. A little bit about it when he was talking about his earlier works. But what's interesting?
Scott, what year? Scott is like this.
This is 2010.
The articles.
Well, he says this really breezy comment somewhere in here where it's like, and I can apply this to Island Southeast Asia, I just haven't done it. About that Hulu Hilir thing, right? He's like, oh, it's all exactly the same, but I haven't done that. And you're kind of like, oh. This is 2010, 2011, right? Yeah. 2009.
So, okay, so you're talking about, anyway, so you're talking about what's very interesting is that another idea came before this, actually, that hill tribes or hill communities were a place for refuge beforehand. And so this probably points to another angle of critique, was that this is not all of Southeast Asia, this is mainland Southeast Asia, maybe, and he's not being as careful. Although to be fair, I think he does talk about mainland Southeast Asia as opposed to upland, right. And so so the point is that other scholars have talked about this idea of flawed or not flawed, right? But so again, the point really is not really about Jim Scott's arguments, but it's really about how do we engage something that we disagree with fundamentally, or how do we disagree with an argument or a thesis where there's an evidentiary problem, a problem of evidence and sources. How do we talk about that in order to justify our own work, or just to set up what our approach is going to be? And what we are suggesting from an editorial perspective is that if you can engage it in a clear and diligent way, it will leave us with the impression that we are dealing with a serious scholar who's not ready to dismiss somebody's work, but who wants to engage that person's work in relationship to their own.
I just thought very quickly of another example, which maybe many of you will be familiar with. If you have read any of Mel Radcliffe's books about Islam in Java, and he has these very formed ideas, about it comes from first you have this mystic synthesis of and it's a sort of syncretic thing, and then you have polarization, and then you have and he kind of has a view of value judgment about that, and I know people find this, people particularly from the region, can find this a little hard to take, and so and he may be wrong, he may be wrong. So it's in a way it's a great opportunity to enter into the debate and kind of take control of it, but if you think he's wrong, then you can certainly say so, but you will have to take it, you will have to engage with it.
And so what does that mean? That means
Yeah.
representing Merle's work accurately about his overall thesis and argument,
Yeah.
and then showing where he's wrong.
Okay, you might say, oh, well, back in the, he's got the time wrong, or, that he hasn't, actually the source, the text is much more orthodox than he has in the way he's characterized it, or, whatever it is. And that would be, very interesting. You have to sort of crank through what he's saying.
I was going to say, and then afterwards, that's when you say, where does your work come in? Because Merle has approached it this way, with certain developmental trajectory, right? Because he is projected here, here, and here, and because I'm detecting something's wrong, this is where my work will come in. And that's how you then connect previous work to your work. Yeah, was that what you're going to?
Yeah, I was coming to that.
Okay. Yeah.
What if the line of the review is showing the debate on certain technology or concept or approach?
Yes, yes.
And then I'm saying that I'm taking this kind of a line of thoughts and
Right.
then but situate my work in something that is not being emphasized and then
Right.
is that the
That's actually a great example, and it's a very common one, I would argue, too, right? Is that usually the field has maybe gone back and forth between two poles of an argument, so a binary of some sort, say between brokerage and network-based relations when it comes to whatever, dispute management, and you're saying, I'm going to focus on this aspect as a way of also engaging in this debate. Thereby suggesting we've been maybe overlooking something, or we have been overemphasizing a particular perspective. There's been like a debate between Ian Brown and Jim Scott, actually, over why Burmese peasants rebelled in the 1930s. Ian Brown, it was Jim Scott and Michael Addis, a world historian, about why did peasants in the 1930s rebel against the British. And so Ian Brown comes in and says, I'm going to settle this dispute by suggesting we go in this direction. But what does he first do? He talks about Michael Addis's perspective, he talks about Jim Scott's perspective, and then he said, this is what I'm going to be doing. So this is the same sort of thing. It's a common thing often that you've usually got two poles, and then someone tries to synthesize it. Or someone says, people are only thinking either or this or this. That's simplifying or confining the discussion to either this, plan A, or plan B. We should be thinking about this option, which no one else has thought about. And that's where your originality comes in. That's how you sort of set up where your fresh interpretation can come in structurally. So it's a very common thing to think from a theoretical perspective, and how you're going to engage in that conversation. Yeah, are there other questions? Do people need more coffee? I think for most of humanities, at least, I would say social scientists as well, they will probably ask this. I'm pretty sure they would ask. Some more technical might not. But most journals are, as we spoke about on Friday, journals are a platform to feature original research. So one of the requirements is to demonstrate that originality. Why it's new, how it's fresh, how it's innovative, how it departs or continues or complements existing scholarship. So the only way to sort of, in a way to suggest or to show that it's really new work is to show how it's new. Different journals, though, will ask you to do it in different ways, I think, or to different amounts. So very technical, the Journal of Global Information Systems, GIS, or something technical. A technical journal may not ask that as much, but for someone in American studies, yeah, I think so. You know, so I mean, if like my colleagues' work focuses on popular culture in America, and if you wanted to sort of talk about, you know, just top of my head, portrayals of Indonesia in transnational cartoons or something in Indonesian about America, he would probably ask if you were the editor to say, well, how does this work fit within scholarship on popular culture in cartoons? You know, at least to show why it's distinctive, why it's fresh, why it's important.
Or maybe there's probably nothing else on that exact topic. So, I mean, this Scott one is different because people have been picking over this material for decades, right? But maybe so say portrayals of Indonesian and American cartoons, and there will be no other study on that. So one thing you will say that this is the first study of this, but I will look at, I don't know, portrayals of different kinds of others in American cartoons, of which I am sure there are, you know, other, like national, different nations, or, you know, internal others in American, you know, popular culture, or something like that. In cartoon, you know, you will find some other things that are like parallel cases or something like that. So even though, and you know, it's great if nothing has been done on it, but it's not going to exist. The topic will never exist in a total vacuum.
And we have to also remember that by showing how your work fits within existing conversations in different ways, it's also a way of establishing its value to different disciplines, different thematic areas. So that example I gave will be interesting for those in media studies, also American studies, but also visual arts. You know, so by contextualizing your work within these various fields of study is also a way of pitching how important your work really is, not just to those American studies folks, but also other folks as well. So it's a way of really saying, you know, my work is very, very important. You know? So it's a way of pitching. It's a way of selling your work by showing that these intellectual conversations that are right now being for the Journal of American Studies, other scholars would want to read it too. And so it's not meant to be a chore, it's an opportunity to say really how innovative, how important your work is.
We have coffee break and then we have individual sessions.
Yes. I think for the next 2 hours, that is going to be our last opportunity to have consultation with these 2 mentors. So I would like to encourage all of you to use that opportunity. Otherwise, we don't have them all together again in this room. Please
just invite us again.
Well, I guess I also want to say, I mean, if we were in different groups, if you were in the other group,
yeah.
I'd be very happy to talk. Obviously, I haven't read your paper, but we can, if you have any questions.
Because in many ways, it fits your journal much more closely too. A lot of work,
a lot
of the work you guys are doing really has a destination here, because in Indonesia, right? In Indonesian online world. So to me, you would lose out, you know, in a Singaporean. You lose out if you don't actually speak to them.
Being more Singaporean.
You know, this is an advantage. I mean, here is an outlet that is spatially, intellectually about all of your work. So please take advantage of it.
Jadi silakan Bapak Ibu yang mau konsultasi langsung, apa mau di ruangan ini atau di ruang sebelah?